Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into some really tough source material about the human cost of drone warfare in Ethiopia, focusing on the Amhara and Oromia regions.
Yeah, it's a grim picture the sources paint.
Our mission here is to unpack what these sources tell us, understand the impact on people, the context, and what it all means. It's definitely challenging stuff.
Absolutely. We need to stick to the facts presented here to get a clear view.
Right. And the sources, they start us off with a specific, very recent, and frankly devastating incident, Gedeb town.
And what's striking is how they immediately focus on the human story.
They really do. They describe April 17th, 2025, in Gedeb. It was morning, apparently quite serene in a, densely populated area.
People just going about their lives.
Exactly. Preparing for Orthodox Easter, some were volunteering, building a fence for a local school, ordinary activities.
But then, as one source dramatically puts it, this normalcy was just shattered by an unseen terror descending from the sky.
Multiple drones, within minutes, no warning at all.
The descriptions of the aftermath are harrowing. Utter devastation. A landscape of carnage, just chaos and terrible suffering.
And the numbers. The sources are chilling. Local officials estimated over 120 killed.
Other reports confirmed over 100 dead,
Mm-hmm.
and significantly, many women and children among them.
It's hard to even imagine. Plus, emergency teams apparently had a really tough time even getting to the scene.
And then you have the conflicting stories, which is key here. The Ethiopian government claimed the strike hit Fano militias.
But the sources are full of eyewitness accounts that strongly, vehemently disagree.
They insist there was zero militia activity nearby. The victims were just civilians, doing normal things, holiday prep, community work.
It just hits home how suddenly daily life can be destroyed, and hitting people doing routine things like that, it suggests an indiscriminate attack, doesn't it? Or at least a terrible failure in targeting.
It creates this pervasive sense of an unseen threat, always there.
Yeah, hanging over everything.
Exactly. And that kind of threat, it just erodes trust. It breeds fear. Even places you thought were safe suddenly aren't.
And this difference between the official story and what people saw.
That consistent discrepancy,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder. The sources suggest it could be a deliberate strategy, to control the narrative, maybe avoid accountability.
Makes independent investigation almost impossible.
Precisely. And it raises serious questions about whether targeting areas known to have civilians is becoming sort of normalized.
So this awful event in Gedeb, it's not an isolated incident, is it? It seems to fit into a bigger pattern. The sources help us trace how drones became so central to this conflict.
They've been used since around 2013, but their use really escalated dramatically during the Tigray conflict, 2020 to 2022.
Yes. The sources describe them as a really decisive asset for the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the ENDF, crucial in pushing back the TPLF offensive.
But that period also saw extensive drone use, contributing to, high civilian casualties, according to the sources.
And after Tigray.
A big expansion. Since April 2023, we've seen significant deployment in Amhara and Oromia. The data is pretty stark.
Like what?
Well, ACLED documented 73 air or drone strikes just in Amhara since April 2023.
73.
And a UN Human Rights Council report covering just August 23 to January 24 noted about 100 drone strikes, leading to at least 479 reported civilian deaths. Innocent civilians.
And Oromia, too.
Yes, strikes recorded there since 2019. So this progression, it shows drone warfare isn't just occasional anymore. It's become normalized and central to Ethiopia's strategy in these internal conflicts.
A strategic reliance, almost.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
And that reliance might, lower the threshold for using force. It's easier from a distance.
And this fits into a bigger picture in Africa.
Yes, the sources point that out. Ethiopia is apparently a top drone-seeking nation, acquired 12 units.
And where are they getting them from? The sources name names.
China, Iran, Turkey, the UAE. And here's a really critical point the sources highlight. None of these suppliers seem to implement human rights requirements in their deals.
Which has huge implications.
Absolutely huge. It's like drone diplomacy. Ethiopia can build ties with these powers, get the tech, and bypass Western scrutiny on human rights.
So it potentially emboldens military approaches.
That's the concern raised. Less international constraint. It could even shift diplomatic alignments away from traditional Western partners.
And now they're moving towards making their own. The sources mention Skywing industry, inaugurated in March 2025.
Right. Domestic manufacturing, civilian and military drones, even looking at exports.
Combined with statements from the army chief, Burhanu Jula, vowing to keep using drones against extremists.
While also saying the Air Force doesn't target civilians. It's a contradiction, but it signals a long-term commitment to this type of warfare.
But the sources argue this strategy might actually prolong the conflicts.
Yes, that's a key argument. Drones were decisive at times, yes, but they haven't proven great at, say, dislodging rebels from strongholds or ending the need for peace talks.
So it's cheap air power, lower risk for the government forces.
But it can lead to these drawn-out stalemates. And the argument presented is that access to these cheap drones in Ethiopia hasn't just caused casualties, it might have made the government less willing to negotiate.
Let's circle back to the people affected and the difficulty getting their stories out. Gedeb is such a stark case, not just for the loss of life, but for the silence afterwards.
We have to keep emphasizing those eyewitness accounts from Gedeb. Victims were civilians, building a fence, celebrating, no Fano insight.
And the World Council of Churches statement?
Yes, condemning it, reporting more than 100 civilians, including women and children, killed while gathered at a primary school. Even local officials confirmed most victims were civilians.
But getting first-hand accounts directly from survivors or families, the sources say that's incredibly hard.
It is. There's this chilling silence because of profound fear. One source quotes a relative asking journalists, "Don't you want me to live?" That says it all.
And this fear isn't just general anxiety. The sources detail specific government actions.
Yes. Reports of local officials, security forces, compiling lists of relatives, eyewitnesses, warning them not to talk.
And if they do?
Reportedly detained. Whereabouts unknown. The sources cite the specific case of Adisu, his brother, detained simply for identifying himself as a drone strike victim.
That sounds like, well, a deliberate strategy to suppress information.
It's presented exactly like that. Systematic intimidation, controlling the narrative, preventing verification, silencing dissent through fear, making examples.
An active effort to erase the human cost, as one source puts it.
Which makes accountability almost impossible. And it worsens the humanitarian crisis because information and aid can't get through properly.
And Gedeb, while horrific, isn't alone. The sources list other incidents showing this disturbing pattern.
That's right. The pattern is important. February 19th, 2025, Amhara. A strike on a civilian truck, maybe 30 killed.
Another truck strike in North Wello, reports of 50 killed.
An 83-year-old woman killed in Bilbla, and then South Shefer. Multiple strikes hitting a market, a school, a health center, children, pregnant women among the dead.
Sources even mention people playing volleyball, sleeping, just working, targeted.
There's another truck strike in North Shewa, 8 from one family killed. And going back 2 years, in Oromia, reports of a strike killing at least 60.
It's relentless, and even established human rights groups like the EHRC struggle to get info because of the fear, and media access is blocked.
Exactly. It obscures the true scale.
Yeah.
But this pattern, targeting civilian gatherings, infrastructure, it suggests potentially indiscriminate attacks, not just isolated mistakes.
The psychological impact must be immense.
Absolutely. Constant threat, fear of speaking out. It creates deep anxiety, distrust, tears apart the fabric of communities.
So given all this, what about the legal and ethical side? What do the sources say?
Well, this widespread use of drones in populated areas draws strong condemnation from rights groups and legal experts cited. The HRRC called the Gedeb Strike a grave violation of international humanitarian law.
Targeting civilians disguised as security. Unacceptable erosion of human rights.
And the core legal issue is the principle of distinction. It's fundamental in humanitarian law. You cannot target civilians or civilian objects, period.
Human Rights Watch documented government forces using drones and heavy artillery against civilians in Amhara.
So incidents like Gedeb or Gedeb at school in Tigray, mentioned in the sources, they're being discussed as potential war crimes.
Because there were apparently no military targets nearby. And the civilian harm was so high.
Precisely. The UN's Human Rights Office, OHCHR, noted the ENDF's drone use led to disproportionate levels of civilian casualties.
It blows up the whole idea of drones being precise or surgical.
It's the precision paradox the sources talk about. The marketing says one thing, the documented reality says another.
What does that imply?
Well, it suggests either a deliberate disregard for distinguishing civilians seeing their lives as expendable, or a fundamental problem with how drones are used in these complex populated zones.
Either way, it's bad.
It's incredibly dangerous. Repeated violations risk undermining the international laws meant to protect people in conflict. It sets a terrible precedent.
And compounding all this is the pervasive lack of accountability the sources keep mentioning.
Authorities are mostly silent. or issue vague denials. Access for independent media, investigators heavily restricted.
So no transparency, no real investigations.
Which is why rights groups keep calling for independent inquiries into these alleged violations of international law.
Let's look at the broader dynamics, too. The sources suggest cheap, accessible drone tech might actually make these wars longer.
That's a really crucial, kind of counterintuitive point they raise. Drones offer cheap air power, less risk to your own forces.
But they don't necessarily win the war.
Right. Not efficient at dislodging rebels completely can lead to these drawn-out stalemates. And the specific argument for Ethiopia is that access to these drones hasn't just caused harm, it may have made the government less willing to negotiate peace.
Because the cost of continuing the conflict feels lower.
It's exactly. Less political or military cost compared to, say, large ground offensives. So the incentive for diplomacy weakens. The focus stays on military pressure, and the human cost just keeps mounting.
And this spills over into humanitarian aid, too.
Severely. Yeah. Aid presence in Amhara is constrained. The UN reports Ethiopia having the highest number of attacks on aid workers, 8 killed just since January. They're even considering suspending relief operations.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's described as a grim synergy. The drone strikes cause casualties and displacement, then the conflict, the displacement, government restrictions, blackouts, targeting journalists, all block aid access and put aid workers in danger.
So the violence triggers effects that prevent help from reaching the victims.
And prevents monitoring of abuses, too. It's a compounding crisis.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the sources clearly show Ethiopia's growing reliance on drone warfare is having a truly devastating human impact. Thousands killed, countless injured, huge displacement, constant fear.
And the pattern of these strikes, combined with the government denials and the active suppression of witness accounts, strongly points towards widespread human rights violations, maybe worse.
All happening alongside broader repression, mass arrests, targeting critics.
It looks like a deeply entrenched cycle of violence and impunity. Without real investigations, without accountability for these alleged war crimes, there's very little reason for tactics to change.
And that risks normalizing the idea that civilian lives are just expendable.
Which further destabilizes the region and kills peace prospects.
And the international dimension.
Ugh.
Getting drones from suppliers without human rights strings attached let Ethiopia avoid Western scrutiny.
Yeah, it basically enabled these operations without significant external pressure, even as some Western countries step back.
So the calls from rights groups for investigations, for respecting international law.
They highlight the moral imperative. The sources suggest we need to move past just condemning towards concrete actions, maybe targeted sanctions, definitely more diplomatic pressure to protect civilians and push for accountability.
Ultimately, the sources conclude the only way forward is for all sides to respect international humanitarian law, stop attacking civilians, and commit to real dialogue. Peaceful resolution.
That's presented as the only sustainable path to justice and peace.
This has been quite a heavy deep dive. Processing this information, it takes time. We want to ask you directly, what really stand out to you from all this? What questions does it spark about warfare, technology, accountability?
Yeah, what resonates with you?
And maybe leave you with this thought to consider. In a world where technology lets you wage war from afar and where fear silences voices on the ground, how do we even make sure the human cost stays visible? How do we ensure accountability is still possible? Thank you for joining us for this